Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
This is Andres, and I have a hard time. Monray Hernandez, did I say it right? Yeah. Who has been doing some awesome work on authoring tools at MIT, and particularly around building community and just understanding what people are trying to do with these tools.
Great.
And so, yay!
Thank you. Thanks a lot for coming. So again, my name is Andres Monroy. I'm a PhD candidate at the Media Lab at MIT. And today I'm going to be talking about one of the areas of my research focusing on designing for remixing around online communities. Is it not working? Well, I'll use this. So just first I wanted to acknowledge some of my collaborators. So for the past 4 years I've been working on this project, and it's been really the result of work by many people, and as well as some of our sponsors. So very briefly, what I'm going to be talking about today is this five areas. First, giving an introduction and a background on why studying remixing and why it's important. Then, focusing on some of the research questions around the work that I've been doing, and then describing the specific environment where I've been doing this research, which is the Scratch online community. And then, talking about some of the design interventions, design experiments, and studies that we've done on this community. And, at the end, you're giving a kind of overview of this research. So just in terms of social creativity and social production is one of the areas that I'm really interested in studying. And when you think about that, the first thing that at least comes to my mind is things like the free and open source software communities that for a very long time now have been engaged in building things in groups that probably one particular individual couldn't have built by themselves. And this is a great example of this type of work. But of course, now we have Wikipedia, and there is like tons of research around Wikipedia, both in trying to understand motivations, trying to understand why is it that Wikipedia succeeded and not other things. So Wikipedia is now kind of the Drosophila of social software in some ways. And there is really a lot of interest trying to understand how these systems work and how to design these systems. But to me, more than just like software or building encyclopedias, what I find really interesting is engaging amateurs. And as much as these systems are open, really the kind of people that are involved in this are non-traditional people in some ways. They're very geeky perhaps, or software engineers, or people who are really interested in knowledge. But there is a lot of other work on more amateurs creating work and sharing them online. So things like YouTube, Flickr, there's all this kind of social media space, which is all about building something and putting it out there. And but what I find interesting about this is not just that anyone can share their videos or whatever, but that really all the things that are there are open for being remixed in many ways. So for any particular video that you might see, in particular the ones that are very popular like this one, you'll see a lot of remixes that people have created of them. So for this baby video, you have like the Kanye West version, then you have the Sparta version from the movie Sparta, and just tons of remixes. For any video that has gotten more than probably 2,000 views, then you'll find some kind of funny remix or maybe sometimes serious remixes. And this is what I find really fascinating about these systems, and one of the areas that I've been focusing on, how to expand the range of people and kind of democratize creation in these spaces. So this is not something new. In fact, Yochai Benkler in his book, The Wealth of Networks, describes how free and open source software, Wikipedia, all these kind of peer production systems are not just about software or just about encyclopedias. They are actually a new form of economic production. And he calls this the commons-based peer production. And he describes how these networked environments really allow for this type of social creativity to flourish. Then also kind of in the same vein, Henry Jenkins talks a lot about what does it mean for culture, not just in terms of the economy that Benkler talks about, what does it mean for culture? And he talks about this convergence of amateurs and professionals coming together and building really interesting stuff. But also people have pointed out that how our current legal and economic system is really kind of flawed and is not really well designed to support this what Leipzig calls remix culture. And he argues that there needs to be some change, and he proposes the Creative Commons and so on. But really, you get this perspective from like the kind of economic production environment or like a kind of point of view, the cultural one, and then looking at this as a system that has different components. So Leipzig actually talks really about how the legal aspect of this is just one aspect of it. The technical infrastructure that supports this system is also a really important component. And then there are the normative and cultural areas around this. So one of the interesting things about social production is not just about producing products, software, encyclopedias, but the process by which this happens. And this is one of the things that I'm really interested in, because even if you at the end don't produce, say, if we get together and we try to make something, even if we don't end up making whatever we decided to make, the process by which we kind of engage in this kind of social creation, it's really a very interesting learning experience. So typically education has been always about something like this, where people giving lectures or whatever. But really, a lot of research, in particular, Seymour Papert is one of the kind of first people who talked about this idea of learning by building. I mean, it's not a new idea, but the idea that people learn the best when they're building something that is personally meaningful to them in the context of a social group. And there is some work by Lieb and Wegner also that talk about this idea of communities of practice and how people, they actually went to Africa and all these different places trying to see how groups of people come together and build stuff together, and how this process is a very is a great model for learning that unfortunately hasn't been kind of translated to the schools and these environments. And more recently, Henry Jenkins again talks about what he considers the core literacy skills that people should have for the 21st century. And he actually describes that appropriation or remixing is one of these kind of core ideas. He says, the ability to meaningfully sample and remix media is one of those things that kids and adults of today should kind of have. More from the design point of view, there is all these kind of social production environments happen thanks to technology in some ways. Not only because of technology, but happen in technologically empowered environments. So there is some work around how to create these type of systems. Actually, there's some work by Yahoo Research where they looked at this website called Jump Cut. I don't know if you ever saw that one. It doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But it was a really cool website, kind of like YouTube, but everything that you saw there was remixable in some ways. So even the internals of a particular video could be decomposed and kind of taken apart, and you could reuse them to create your own things. There is also some work on music remixing on this community called CC Mixter. And there is, of course, a lot of work on Wikipedia and other systems like that. So what I'm focusing on is in the idea of remixing in the sense of people building something out of pieces that already exist. And it could be pieces that somebody else made. And this idea of remixing is not new. I mean, there is a lot of different terms in different fields. If you talk to programmers, you might talk about forking or forks. If you talk to DJs or video DJs, they talk about mashups. There is appropriation art, from postmodernist art. There is tons of different words for the same kind of phenomena, where people are building on existing work. And what I think is key about remixing is that it's social. It's not just about being alone and making stuff. And it's a really nice example in some ways of online collaboration and how it can happen. And it's creative as well. So just kind of to recap, there is, I'm interested in this idea of how to design these systems in the context of their social and cultural environments for the purpose of supporting a particular kind of philosophical view of learning in a more kind of constructivist learning. So just in terms of kind of the broad research questions that I'm focused on, again, I'm interested in, how to design these socio-technical systems, the systems that not only rely on technology, but rely on people that support this collaboration through remixing. And in particular, I'm interested in three things. The first one is, what are the structural properties of these systems? What are the key ingredients from the technology point of view, from the architecture, from the social aspects that make these systems work? And second, what are the roles that remixing plays in the culture of these environments? And third, what are people's attitudes towards remixing? How people feel, how amateur creators feel about remixing. We hear a lot about what corporations think about remixing. Oftentimes they are not very happy about it, but we don't often hear what young people or amateurs think about it. So in order to kind of focus on these questions, you could take an approach of studying a lot of these really interesting environments. Or what I did was actually build a community where people engage in this type of social production. And this community is called Scratch. How many of you have seen Scratch before? So yeah, a lot of you. So I'm just going to go very quickly. The idea of Scratch is an online community where kids can share their own animations, video games, interactive art. There's tons of projects, projects from animation, animated videos, music videos, to physics simulations, to more kind of interactive art kind of things. And one of the cool things about Scratch is that everything that people upload there is downloadable, and it's, you can see how it was made. So just to give you an example, this is one particular project. Let me see. And this project was, you could download it and see how it was made within the desktop application of Scratch. You can, change stuff, move it around, and make your own version of it. So, for example, this project was remixed by some kid, and they, you can see that they changed the spaceship for, the picture of John McCain. This was around the election, and this is the kind of things that we see often happening, not like changes in the aesthetics of the project as well as the code. And this is kind of one way in which people participate in the community. And one of the cool things about this site, just like any other social media site, you can leave comments on people's projects and say, oh, this is really funny or whatever. So in the past 4 years since we released the website, we have now more than 1.8 million projects, projects from people from all over the world. And what is really cool is that 25% of the projects are remixes of other projects in the community. So remixing is really a really important form of participation. There is 800,000 people who have registered, and about 200,000 of them have made a project, which is pretty high, compared to other systems. In terms of the activity month to month, we have about 65,000 new projects in March. And what is interesting is, the rate of remixes, pretty much stays the same, except in this spike. But overall, it stays the same in terms of, the percentage of remixes over the total number of projects. In terms of people who are using the community, it's primarily kids. You see, from 11 to 17, 19 is the primary, age range. The mode is 14 years old. And so you see a lot of these kids are, in middle school or early high school. So the red is males, and red is females, and blue is males. So yeah, you can see the distribution is somewhat even. So one of the things that I've been doing around Scratch is not just build this community and seeing how people use it. I've been studying how people are using it, and also been doing some design experiments. So one of the first things that we saw, actually, it was 3 years and 9 months ago. We saw kids sharing not only projects like animations or games. They were also sharing these kind of things were like more like templates that they invited other people to reuse. So you can see here in the notes it says here are some simple walking sprites. So these were like a collection of sprites, people walking, there was a bird flying, things like that. And then she says, they're perfect for platform games, kind of inviting people to say, you could reuse them in your games. And then she said, if you want a sprite of your very own, leave a comment in my gallery and I can, make it for you. So we start seeing a lot of this kind of service in some ways, kids providing services of making things for other kids. So this project actually got this comment from this other girl who said, thanks a lot. I would like to have a background for my game. And then she explains that she's making a company. She says it's not a real company. She calls it GradCrank Inc. And she basically says, I'm making these games, and I want to have like a group of people doing this work. And what was interesting is that they both started to collaborate. So one girl will make the kind of sprites, the drawings, and the movements, and the other girl will integrate them and put them into a game. So this went on for a few days, a few weeks, and then other kids started to notice, and they became really excited that they wanted to join. So they had to, they had to kind of filter out the applicants. So they started to request a portfolio. They had to explain what kind of skills they will bring to the group. So it was really interesting to see this emerge. So in a few weeks after they released their first, project, we started seeing people from, there was this kid from New Jersey, this kid from Ireland, people from Russia. There were like lots of kids participating in this group. They never met each other before. They had this kind of assign roles that they gave to each other. And, it could grow, but not too much, because, these groups have to be somewhat small. So what happened is, because, this group was somewhat crowded, is that other kids were like, well, if I cannot join GradCrank, I'm going to make my own company. So then other kids started to make their own kind of quote companies. And then this became like a, kind of like a form of participation in the community. So kids now saw this kind of company making as a cool thing to do and a way that they could start in scratch. So we studied one of these particular companies, one called Gray Bear Productions. So this company, we studied over 3 months, and during these 3 months that we looked at it, they developed 6 projects. And about each project, in average, had 17 remixes that they had to create in order to release that project. So you can see here is, like different versions of the same project. Each one of them was a remix of the other. And the way they use remixing was as a kind of, I will start my prototype, and I will say, here is Lily. You can now change it and make your own, version. And we will talk over the comments of the galleries where they kind of interacted of what is the next step and who is going to do what. So they kind of divided labor in this way. But one of the things that we saw is that remixing was a really interesting and great and positive way of engaging the community. So we saw kids who said things like, "Oh, I love what you did with my project with your remix." But we also saw a lot of like negative aspects of remixing. Things like you're a copycat, or hello, Mr. Player. These are all real quotes from the website. Or this one, like somebody was really upset about their project being remixed. They were like, "This is not okay. I'm not okay with you taking my work." So we started to first trying to see how often this happened, and one of the other things that we saw is that there were kids actually creating groups to fight the copycats. So there were the copycat cops was one of these groups, and these were kids, creating these missions where they were going around the website, browsing and seeing if there were any kind of illegal remixes. So then we looked at the kind of range. We took a sample of projects and tried to see how people react to remixing. So we found that the negative and the positive were pretty similar, and there were a lot of people who reacted positively, but there was also a lot of people who were not very happy about remixing. We looked at things like what predicts this positive outcome of remixing, and one of the things, or what predicts negative outcomes. So one of the things that we saw is that when people invested a lot of time making their projects, if the more complicated the project was, the more likely they were to complain about remixes of their projects. The other thing that we found, which was really interesting, is that if people had remixed themselves, like if they had engaged in remixing before, they could still complain about remixing. Like it didn't really matter. Like people were kind of, they had, yes?
2 questions. One, did you see an age dependence with respect to the relative positive versus negative? And the other is that Scratch has a built-in attribution mechanism, right? So you'll see what. So even if someone steals it, like they'd still see the change.
Right. Yeah. So actually, this is the next study that we did because we didn't have that feature before.
Oh, you didn't.
So this is an intervention that is kind of like an experiment that we did. So in terms of age, we saw that the younger they were, the more likely they were to complain.
Oh, really?
And also, males tended to complain more than females. The effect was not as strong as some of the others, but still. It was kind of very clear that males were kind of like, this is my project, you're not supposed to take it, and also the younger they were. So one of the things that we also got actually were people suggesting like ways in which we could address this problem of bad remixing. So one of the kids actually suggested that we should have like a read-only version of a project where people could only see it but they cannot touch it. We didn't really like this idea because we thought that the whole idea about Scratch was that you could actually build on other people's project. But this other kid actually suggested something, which is what we actually did. He said something like, you should mark it with the creator's name at the bottom. So like if I remix Lily's project, it will say, made by Andres, but based on Lily's project. So this is what we actually ended up doing. We got a lot of these requests, and we kind of did this in a more experimental way. So again, we have the project, we have the name of the creator, and then it says based on so-and-so's project. So we did that. And we tried to see what the effect of that was. My idea was that will probably solve all the problems. But turns out that we saw that before automatic attribution and after automatic attribution, you can pay attention to the height of this. And then the differences between before and after were not very significant. Actually, they were not significant at all. So we saw no change in people were not more positive about it. They were not more negative or silent. We also, one of the things that we can do is that we track when people visit a project. We can see if they visited it and if they said anything. So you saw that you see that there is not really a big difference between automatic attribution and not automatic attribution. So we were puzzled by this, and we were trying to figure out why that happened. So we started browsing around, the website, and we found that a lot of the kids were using the project notes as a way to give credit. Even though there was this automatic attribution, they still felt the need of saying, I created this based on so-and-so's project. And then we were wondering, well, maybe that's actually what makes a big difference between the positive and the negative. So then we, again, took the same sample, And then we looked at kind of these projects between the ones who have credit and the ones without credit, and we actually saw a increase of positiveness. When there is credit in the notes, then people tend to be more positive. In some ways, you can interpret this as like people were quiet in some ways, but as soon as you see that somebody's leaving credit in the notes, you're like, oh, this person actually took the time to write down my name or whatever, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to say something positive. Yeah?
Directions, like one thing that I think some other system had, can't remember which one, some remixing thing, but like sometimes it's nice to be able to go back to the source material. So somebody, maybe the woman who was making the animated characters, right? And then you could say that like these are being used in 150 other projects, right? Or like there's some discounted number of hits from those other projects which can feeds back to this, so you get like some virtual hit count which has to do with all your.
Yeah, so that's actually the second intervention that we did. Okay. Yeah, you're describing exactly the process that we went through. So one of the things that we wanted to understand, we saw this in the data, but we wanted to actually get, talk to people and see if they actually thought this way, or if it was just some kind of weird thing in the data. So we actually interview people. So let me show you. This first, I asked a bunch of kids, what do you think about remixing? I showed them on paper these kind of fictional cases of remixing, and I told them, what do you think about this case and this case? So first, I asked this kid, what do you think about remixing? Let me see if I have sound. Well, yeah, no, but I don't hear. Oh, there. Yeah, I can't put it here. Give me a definition of remixing.
Taking somebody else's project and then doing.
So, let me see. Well, you can barely hear, but you can read there. Let me see if I can increase the sound. It's all the way up. This mic? So first I asked him to give me a definition of remixing. Give me a definition of remixing.
Taking somebody else's project and then changing a lot of it, then sharing it and giving credit.
Mm-hmm. So you can see that the giving credit aspect was an important aspect for this kid.
They're copies. Mm-hmm. If Green had actually said in the project notes, this is a remix of Red's project, full credit goes to him.
Right.
Then I would consider it a remix. But this is definitely a copy.
I see. And this was in response to an example that I showed him where like there was automatic attribution, but there was not manual credit. And he said, well, it's fine, but he should actually say that. And then again, one of the things that we thought is like, well, maybe one thing that we could do is we could appeal to reputation. And one of the things that we saw, a lot of the kids were really excited about being on the front page of the website. So in fact, there was this kid who described how you can be popular on Scratch as a way to kind of give you a sample of what people feel about being famous.
How to get your projects popular. Step 1. Take time over your project to make it a decent project. That way people are more likely going to love your project. Step 2. Add lots of people to your list of friends. Then you're more likely going to have people to love your project. Step 3. Add your project to a gallery, so then when people are searching through other people's galleries, they'll find your project. Step 4. Put your project under a popular tag, and then more people are going to find it when they're going through the most popular tags.
So this is just to show you how people really care about being popular. And one of the things that people use for popularity is they use the front page. So the front page is popular with things like feature projects, projects that are top loved, top viewed. So different ways in which projects can get to the front page. And one of the things that we added was this top remix project. So if my project gets remixed a lot, then I could be featured on the front page. So that's how the section looks like. And one of the things that we saw is that people started to create these projects that are explicitly for remixing. So this created a new genre of projects. So this is one example. These are like chain remixes. So actually, this is because a few months ago, we received this takedown notice by Viacom because there was some kid who made a Pac-Man game, and apparently Pac-Man owns, Viacom owns Pac-Man. and then they send us a cease letter. We had to take down the project, and we explained to the kids what happened, and then they were really upset, like, oh, why is Viacom doing this? So then this kid kind of used remixing and this type of chain remixing as a way of engaging the community in this kind of expressive form of creation. So you see, this is one of the projects that remixed this first one, and there are tons of avatars that people added to the project, and they were like running around and doing all these things. So that's an example of what happened once we added this top remix category on the front page. And one of the things that we are studying right now is what was the impact in terms of decreasing complaints. And what kind of anecdotally what we found is that it did decrease complaints, but also increased remixing a lot. And it kind of created this new genre of participation, like these chain remixes. And one of the things that we have on the website, we have this visualization under every project that you see that is a remix. You can click on the number of remixes, and it shows you this kind of visualization. It's like a little JavaScript widget that you can then browse through all the remixes that have been generated from one particular project. So you see this project by Archmage generated all these other projects, and then this one's generated all these other ones. And then the chain remixes are more like this, where there is like one adding to the next one and the next one and the next one. So it was really interesting to add this visualization and also to see what people are doing thanks to the visualization, these kind of more chain remixes. We've been logging all the visits to the visualization, and one of the things that I'm planning to do is to look at what was the effect of the visualization, whether it made a difference or not. Because we often see lots of visualization and we're like, oh, nice, and then we just move on. I want to figure out whether that had an effect or not. So, kind of wrapping up in terms of the different things that I've been doing, I've been thinking about ways of structuring or thinking about this space in a way that kind of makes sense, not just for Scratch, but also for other kind of remixing communities. So I've been thinking about the structural dimensions of remixing. And I've been thinking that, these kind of attributes are the core of what makes a remixing system work. So, for example, what I was describing before around attribution and credit is part of what, one of the important elements that we need to consider when thinking about remixing systems. The other aspect, Scratch in particular is an interesting space because everything that you see there, it can be decomposed in its internal parts. So every single sprite, every single character, every piece of code, it's an element that can be taken apart and reused. So each of these components can be reused, and the size of the components, there's a lot of work on Wikipedia, for example. People argue that the reason why Wikipedia has succeeded is because the granularity of the contribution is super. You could even contribute one character, right? You can add, remove a typo or something like that. And that has allowed lots of people to contribute because you might not feel like writing a whole article, but you might feel like, fixing a typo here and there. So granularity is an important aspect for this kind of social production. Again, also modularity, which is kind of like the opposite of decomposability, the idea of how easy is it to put together pieces that are out there into something new. And one of the other things is around openness. How open is the system? In the case of Scratch, everything is open, but you could imagine a system where maybe you don't allow people to remix other people's work unless they explicitly say so. So these are kind of some of the structural dimensions that I feel like are important to consider. And then again, in terms of the functions that remixing plays in Scratch and other communities, I've been thinking about in these two axes. On the one side is what is the size of the group that is involved in the remixing process. So, I mentioned these groups like GradCrank or Graver Productions that are kind of like more than 2 people. There are also pairs, like at the beginning, GradCrank was just these 2 kids working with each other. And then there are crowds, like crowd remixing, like the chains, where there's like tons of people adding to a project. And so we see this in terms of size, and in terms of the size of how much you borrow from another person's work. Could be from taking the whole project, which is actually quite controversial in Scratch. If you copy somebody else's project and don't change anything, that's probably not okay. And you can also, just take a little piece. You can take an image or a sound or a piece of code, or you could take a sprite, like a whole character. So I see that the different types of remixing and the roles that remixing plays in this learning community are around these two dimensions. And finally, one of the things that, again, I've been looking at is, what are people's attitudes towards remixing, both from the perspective of the originator or the perspective of the remixer, the person creating the remix. So from the perspective of the originator, I've seen people from being really encouraging, inviting other people to remix their work, or people who have seen, say you can remix, but you have to follow these certain rules. And they're like, the community has developed certain normative standards of what's okay and what's not okay to remix. And there's other people who are like completely against remixing, no matter what. And actually, we had some kids who have left the community because they were not okay with the kind of openness of Scratch. They were like, well, I don't want people to touch my projects. And we were like, well, this is the way it is in Scratch. And they were like, well, okay, so I'm going to leave. So some kids just don't like that. There is also, in terms of the remixer, you can see that sometimes people are extremely sensitive of other people's work, and they have to ask for permission, which they don't have to, but they feel like they need to ask for permission. Or sometimes they know the norms and they know, when you ask for permission and when you don't. And there's other kids who actually engage in remixing as a form of trolling. So they're like, I'm going to remix your project making fun of you, or I'm going to remix just as a way to annoy you by not changing anything. So we see this kind of range of remixing and happening in Scratch. So just to end, let me see. One of the key things that I've been thinking about is, what is the next Wikipedia in some ways? So we've seen, lots of different projects in the open source community, Wikipedia, but what is it that, comes next? And I see Scratch and other systems like this, engaging empowering amateurs as kind of one of these ways in which one could think of, opening social creativity for everyone. And not only allowing people to read, which is what television does, or like receive content, and not only allowing people to write and publish their work, but also engage people in remixing and working with other people. So this is kind of where I'm at, and I feel like it points in a direction on which I feel systems should move forward, and that it really involves both the design of these systems as well as the understanding of the cultural and social norms of these systems. So the way I see my work is not only as a designer or not only as a kind of researcher, but I see design as a way of understanding. And I think this is kind of the way a lot of the research around this area could move forward in the future. So with that, I leave it for questions.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
With the remixes, I'm assuming that most of the remixes were just changing the content, the sprites, the graphics, the colors, versus changing the code. Do you have any, statistical number about what the balance was there?
Yeah, I haven't done it lately, but the last time I did it was like maybe 70% of projects were changing just aesthetics, and 30% were changing pieces of like code actually. And one of the things that I was surprised about is that people seem to be more sensitive about the change of aesthetics than the change of code. So in some ways, one of the things that I've been thinking about is that maybe there are two modes of working with other people, like the engineer mode in some ways, where it's like people are more willing to share their code because they feel like their ideas in some ways, and they're less protective of their work. And I feel like a lot of the kids who are more in the artist kind of side, they're super protective of their creations, maybe because they see this as like, I finished this thing and it's done and it's like untouchable in some ways. And a lot of the tensions that we had is with artists more so than game makers, which are more like programmers. Yeah. Yep.
I was going to say two things. Well, I really like this work. I think it's really cool, and I've been a fan of Scratch for a long time. But I think that the attribution aspect is really important. So one, I was going to say that I think it's quite different from Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia is a case where people are really trying to. They're kind of people's attitudes, and there have been some studies on this and how people are looking at it more as a means of kind of helping the gestalt of overall information and things. In other words, this is really about creativity and your own creation. In fact, Wikipedia even says like no original content, right? Like it all has to be like reported stuff. And this is really about people making their own things. Now, the thing I was going to say from my own experience from doing art stuff is I think that. So I think the thing you said about the aesthetic work versus the programming is a very interesting one. I think what you said is exactly right, and especially when you start out, it's kind of like, well, I've made something that's done, right. And you have this attitude that like, I did the whole thing, and it's done. Why are you messing with my thing? It's done. And I want to be famous for doing the whole thing. Right. And then as time goes on, and you realize like, well, lots of other people are good at lots of other things, and it's okay for my thing to be a component, of what other people are doing. Like that, it changes. And I just wonder if there's anything that you can do from the community aspect. Like I had always hoped that the attribution aspect would actually help a lot with this, that people would still feel empowered knowing that their thing had helped a lot of people. But I wonder if maybe part of this is an education thing to kind of like, to help people understand that, no, it doesn't make your project worse when someone else takes it somehow,
Right. And I feel like this is part of like the culture of the community in some ways. And, who knows, a lot of these kids are in schools where, schools are all about, you have to do your own work, and it's all very individualistic. But one of the systems that I find really fascinating, actually, I've been doing some research on this other website called 4chan, probably some of you know. You probably shouldn't go there if you should just read the Wikipedia article about it. But one of the interesting things about 4chan is that there is a lot of creative work, and all of this happens without usernames. So the site is completely anonymous. There's no usernames at all. And there's a lot of people who spend, fair amount of time, putting together this image of a cat with some captions or some funny things. And you see this site. So what we've been doing, we've been screen scraping the site, trying to see how these memes emerge and so on. And one of the things we see is that the majority of content that is published anonymously, and it's really, really fast. So a thread on 4chan lasts, on average 5 minutes. And on the front page, only 20 seconds. It's like really, really fast. And what we see is that a lot of these iterations are people just putting like some idea, some drawing, some kind of piece of art in some ways, and then letting other people remix it in their own ways. And you see these kind of memes emerge really, really fast, and people start engaging in this form of production that is very different from DeviantArt or YouTube, where it's like the username, the profile page, and all these things. And I feel like people in this community, they get it. They know that you put something there, and maybe you are not even proud of it, and you just don't want your name associated to it. And I wonder if there are things that we could do around that they cannot be ugly like 4chan, but they can be open and anonymous in some ways, but within a community of people that know and trust each other. And when I was talking to this professor, actually, she was saying how she's the head of a department, and she said how she feels like she often goes to her colleagues, and her colleagues don't give her like good feedback because they're afraid that she might, do something to them. And she said, I wish there was a system where I could write something and people can anonymously give comments to my work, because I don't want my name, to be kind of a powerful force of like maybe people feel kind of scared. And I feel like there is somewhere in between where, Scratch is very much like YouTube or, all these websites where there is a username, a profile page. But there might be another way in which people might be interested in engaging in participating, and that doesn't have to be associated with names and doesn't feel like you have to finish something and share it. It can be a draft or...
Expectations would change a lot if it was anonymous, but I think also the level of effort and the kind of passion people would put in their projects would change. I mean, making a lolcat, doesn't take a whole lot of effort. But it's like if someone's like, oh, I spent a month making this awesome walking character, then they're like, don't mess with my character. And they probably wouldn't want to put it up anonymously because they'd be like, I put a lot of work into this.
Definitely. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I'm still trying to figure out, whether the nature of the product also matches the nature of the social environment, and I think it might, right? So like maybe like for example for Wikipedia, it's great that it almost feels like people don't really care about attribution, right? So if I write something there, it's like whatever. But if you look at YouTube or other sites, people do, and then the qualitative nature of the content generated there is different. So maybe it is something that we cannot change, and if you want to make pieces of art, you need this attribution and this artist who is like super famous. If you want something fast and remixable, you might need to do something different. Mm-hmm.
The idea of like letting people opt out of having certain content remixed or something like that. Like I've created this, but I want to tag it as not. And maybe you have to earn that. Like you have to do so many things that can be remixed that people use to earn some credit, so that you can say I want to pay to have this one not.
Right. Yeah, we haven't done that in part because my idea with the Scratch community was that it's open and all this kind of ethos of sharing. But as an experiment, it would be really cool to see how people will change their.
It would be kind of interesting to figure out whether people would discover that they didn't get as much traffic as a result of not allowing them to be remixed, and maybe the value is in remixing in some ways.
That's a good point. Yeah, definitely.
Have you like one thing when you think of Wikipedia, there's kind of this grand challenge, which is making an encyclopedia of the whole world.
Right.
I mean, have you thought of putting in challenges like build a game which would require like collaboration?
Yeah, in fact, a few months ago we did this collab challenge. The idea is that we put these kind of rules, and you had to be at least 2 people, and we invited people to join this challenge. And we saw really interesting work coming out of it. The challenge was not great because it was not like a grand challenge. It was more like you have to use the following sprites, and you have to do it in a group, and then we are going to pick the best projects. So what happened is that some kids were lying, and they were like, oh yeah, I'm with my friend Susie or whatever. And you can see the IP is the same, the account was like probably the same person. But other kids engaged in this like really interesting, so especially the kids who have already become really famous in the community, they were like, okay, I'm going to do a group. And Arshmesh is one of these kids who is older and is really technically savvy. He said, I'm going to create a group. Anyone who wants to join, apply here. And he had like very strict rules on what the project was going to be, how it's going to happen. And that group actually developed the most interesting of all the collab games that people made. And in part was this kind of benevolent dictator model where he's like, I know what to do, and people trust me. I'm famous in the community, and people follow me. So we've seen that happening as well. And in that case, people didn't care that much that he was getting some ways the credit because they wanted to be associated with him. So they were like, oh, it's great that I'm working with this famous guy, even if my name is not like shown highly visible in the website. So you see a lot of these kind of more social techniques that you could imagine to empower people to collaborate. Yeah.
And then we talked earlier, but one of the things that you talked about, which I thought was kind of interesting, you just kind of opened it up for discussion, is you said that there were some things that these tools, like maybe you could talk about some of the kinds of things that you'd be interested in working on.
Right.
Kind of given this is.
Right. So actually, I wanted to show an example kind of related to that. So there was this kid who made this project. And this project is actually really simple from the Scratch perspective. It's basically a reflex tester. And the idea was that you will click start, and then it will change the color of the screen to yellow. And when that happens, you have to click stop really quickly. And that was kind of like what it was. And then you had to do it 5 times, and at the end it gives you a number. And what this kid was doing was for a science fair project is that he was asking people to do that and leave in the project notes underneath the project the number that you did and whether or not you play sports and what kind of sports you did. So he was kind of hacking in some ways the social system of Scratch to collect data from kids. And at the end he had like thousands of comments. Actually, I don't know if it's here, but you can see there's like 1,500 views, and all of these people left the comment, like 5 seconds, I play, basketball, whatever. And then he collected all this data, and he created another project where he had this kind of correlation, whether there was, some relationship between playing sports and being fast at, video games. And to me, that was a great example of the kind of things that are not in Scratch or in any other system that I've seen, where it's not only about thinking about computation in the sense of like, oh, I'm going to make a game or this kind of complicated algorithm, but it's also a space where you can leverage the power of crowds in some ways, where you can use these computational skills of building something like this and gather either funny or interesting data or any kind of thing. In this case, it was just numbers, but you could imagine this opening up for like maybe video or maybe sound. So I feel like the next generations of tools that allow people to build stuff are stuff that are kind of building on the social aspects of these technologies. So in one of the things that we see a lot in like Facebook, for example, or Twitter, people often are asking questions to their friends, and it's all text. It's only text. There is not really much on more complicated type of media, and there's also not much you could do to change the system of Facebook or Twitter. It's like it's what it is, and you have to use it. And I feel like the ability to let people build their own social computing systems on top of systems that already exist, and using some of this kind of basic computational power is something that I think we will see more, or we should see more in the future, because it really opens up creative work and the power of the grid or cloud computing, whatever you want to call it, to everyone. Right now is we are waiting for whatever some developer is going to do for us, and this idea of like really opening it up for everyone, I think, should be the next step. Yeah.
Anybody else have questions? Tom or Paul or Chris or Will? Who else? People from the team or anybody else?
I gotta save mine for later.
Yeah. Okay. Shelley, did you have any?
It was, I guess it's kind of related to what you were just talking about, but thinking more generally about this sort of remixing idea, where do you see it going in the next 5 years?
Around remixing?
What's that?
About remixing in particular, or?
Well, yeah, remixing and online collaboration.
Right. So I mean, the way I see things is that I'm interested personally on building systems that help us understand how people work and also empower people. So that's kind of the space where I'm interested in, and remixing is one of these phenomena. There is other phenomena that are also really interesting and really powerful. So one of the things that we see actually around Scratch is that we have this discussion forum, which originally was designed just to ask questions about technical things. I'm stuck with this and whatever. And it turns out that people started to use it, to chat and talk to each other and doing this kind of more social stuff, which was okay. But after a while, people started developing games on the forums, where it's like people started to create kind of like role-playing games using the text forums as a way to engage other people. Like they saw Scratch as like, oh, that's great, but I also want to make these stories in collaboration with other people. So we see a lot of kids writing like, this game is about a princess that is in a castle, and now you're allowed to create your own character. And then this other person comes in and leaves a comment saying, oh, okay, I'm the horse or whatever. And they start building this story collaboratively, and there are like tons and tons of pages of these stories. And what is interesting is like this grew so much that it was kind of bothering other people who were not participating in it, because people were like trying to ask, how do I do a loop or whatever? And so what we did, rather than closing it down, I created this separate website with just about text-based games. And it has flourished like crazy. It's been one of the most active spaces on the Scratch community. It has little to do with Scratch, and it has more to do with building things with other people using just text. And I see that as one example of the kind of tools that, one of the interesting things that people are not only using the text, but also now they're using like hyperlinks as a way to do this kind of like build your own story kind of thing, where it's like, click here if you want to choose to be a princess, click here if you want to be a prince or whatever. And then you can click that and it takes you to another thread in the forums. They're kind of hacking this because it's really ugly and it's not really nice, and they embed videos and they do things. And I see these, as a designer, I see, well, maybe it would be great if we could, build some tools around these existing practices and really empower people to kind of do this kind of work. So that's kind of around remixing in some ways, but also kind of extending it to collaborative work around creating stories or games.
Can you show us that?
Yeah. It's actually really simple. If you'll see it, you'll be like, this is. Oh, I don't have Wi-Fi?
Maybe not. Use the link there.
Okay. Yeah, well, so if you go to TBG forums, scratch.mit.edu TBG forums, you'll find lots of stories. There are like thousands of projects now.
Yep. More question. So I'm wondering about how this might work in adult communities versus with kids, and how their expectations and interests might be different. Like I've seen in recent years, like some of the maker communities, like especially stuff around like hardware hacking, Arduino and Make and stuff like that, have grown, but they're interesting. They're very different from Scratch. Like they're kind of like, I'm going to help show you how to make X, or here's the kind of finished kit to do that. There's not as much kind of like cooperative, at least in what I've seen. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the expectations for adults are different. If you have any thoughts about like what would remixing look like for the kind of more adult community.
Right. I actually think that there's not much different. I mean, in terms of the social dynamics, are probably very similar.
Sorry.
But I think the main difference is that adults tend to, I think, understand better, perhaps, the perspective of other people, and that might help to, create different kinds of environments. So one example that comes to mind is MATLAB, this programming language. They run these contests where basically the idea there is to they put a challenge, basically a problem, and then they have a particular set of inputs that your program in MATLAB is going to receive, and then you're supposed to submit your code, and if it performs high, you're going to be the winner. So they actually did this comparison of like opening it up a bit, kind of anyone can submit the code and anyone can see the code of anyone else and remix it, or make it closed so that people submit their code and then at the end they tell you whether you won or not. And what they found is that a lot of adults, kind of like in Scratch, they were like, oh, I will never participate in a system where anyone can copy my code and just make a little, semicolon change or whatever, and then, they win. But the ones who actually decided to stay, they found this a really interesting and really worthwhile experience. And one of the fascinating things about it is that, there was a lot of people who were like submitting their code and they saw, they performed well, and then somebody else went and saw the website and they were like, okay, I'm going to grab the highest performing code, make a little change, and then, I'm the winner now. So they kind of they iterated really fast. But one of the really interesting things about it is that oftentimes the winner came from an unexpected entry. So like there were these entries that were like increasing kind of incrementally the speed, and then there was this one that was really, really slow, but actually was really interesting approach to the problem. And then somebody will find it and they're like, oh, that's actually an interesting approach. It's just that this person doesn't know of these optimization methods in MATLAB. So then all of a sudden that one that was a slow one became the fastest one, and then it could be the one that wins. So to me that shows an example of where design could actually provide a space for people maybe valuing different forms of participation and different kind of ideas. And in that case, it really benefited from giving access to people who might not even win, but they were interested to see, I have this idea, maybe it won't work. I'm not an expert in MATLAB. Maybe somebody else could take it and do it.
There's this guy, Ned Gully.
Yeah, he does those.
He has, for MATLAB, he gives an awesome talk on, there's kind of this really interesting relationship in MATLAB contest between collaboration and competition, right? Because he said you just want to balance, because it is a contest with an end date and there's a winner, but the ideas do build on each other, and they actually track incremental differences versus all the branches. You can see it, It's super cool.
It's interesting. I mean, did they do the attribution thing as well? Like, were you able to see like all the component people who were involved?
Yeah, you can see that. Yeah.
You can. Oh, okay, so that
really
so
cool.
that probably helps.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, I just seen other communities like I can't remember what it's called again. There's been several kind of music startups, where you can do these remixes and they do attribution of some kind, so you can see this stuff. But they all fail. And like Dan Morris and I looked at a bunch of these and we're like, oh, the idea is so good. And like, why does it always fail? And it's like, and you kind of see people like kind of, it's like, okay, well, either the best people aren't getting on this, or the people who are there aren't putting their A game, into the tracks that they actually upload and stuff like that. And you get this sense, I don't know, maybe it's because musicians are just more inherently think everyone's stealing from them all the time.
Right. But I think this is a space where there is, when we show Scratch to like programmers, sometimes they're like, oh, that's not really code. That's just like kids playing, these blocks that code is never going to be like that. And maybe it's true, code might never be like Scratch. But one of the things that we see is that you are really opening you're opening this space to new people. So maybe the professional musicians will never engage in these projects, but maybe there are people who are amateurs and exploring, and they're like, well, I don't have anything to lose. I'm just learning. And I think like YouTube is an example of that. You don't see super famous people sharing their movies there. Although now even the president shares things there. But it had to be validated by millions of people saying, I'm going to share a silly picture of my cat or a video of my cat doing something funny. And once you have like 50 million videos of that, then you're like, well, there's a lot of people there. Then it becomes validated in some ways. So maybe that's what needs to happen with these systems.
Remember how you said, like, even with the kids, you'd see like much more willingness to share for code or have remixing for code versus aesthetic content.
Yeah, but movies,
the same kind of balance.
Movies invalidate that, right?
Well, but in movies, are they being remixed though, or are they just like?
People make original content on YouTube.
So, but there have been cases of like I can't remember which one now, but those auto-tune the news guys.
Yeah, I saw
those guys. But like some of the people who have been auto-tuned get really pissed.
Yeah.
And other people are like, "This is great." So they're still like, I don't know.
It seems like jQuery is almost exactly like Scratch, right? There's all the libraries that have gotten pushed out, and you keep attribution in the comments per license, I guess. It doesn't seem like code has to be not like this. Certainly, it's harder in a paid software environment. But
when I think about it, even personally, like I'm like, oh, throw my code out so other people could use it and remix it. Like that's fine. But I'm like, throw like my music out and other people like reuse my tracks.
So are you a professional musician? Or?
No, I'm not. God, no. But I'm like, I'm an amateur, and like,
It's interesting that you feel that way about music, even though you're an amateur, and you don't feel that way about your professional.
That you're professional.
Yeah, it's true.
Maybe because they're getting paid, and you're like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's different. It's somehow like I have to think about it more, but I think it's something to do with like. Well, this was my expression I was trying to use. They actually had a case where, like, I had a song that I'd done and I put it out on YouTube, and I just had a jam with this one guy one afternoon, and without telling me, he went and redid a complete version of the song, did a studio version, put it on an album, and like a day before he releases the album, he's like, oh, so by the way, I did this. What do you think? And I was like, well, I'm not sure I like this. And he's like, well, it's kind of too late because it's going to be on my album tomorrow. And I was like, I was really pissed. Like, the one hand I'm like, well, it's flattering that someone would take my song and like, put, $3,000 in a studio to make it into a full-on version. But on the other hand, I was just like, but that's
was it more about like you felt like your work was being used in a way that shouldn't be used, or was it about the attribution? Like, he wasn't giving you enough credit.
Minor notes. He was kind of a jerk, so he didn't. I mean, well, he did give me attribution eventually, but I think it was more the former that bugged me more, because I was like, I wrote this thing with a particular mood and a particular kind of thought and composition, and then he kind of did like this hard rock version of the song, and I was like, well, that's kind of interesting, but that's not what I meant, and it was kind of, I don't know, it felt weird.
Yeah.
Whereas with my code, like I've had lots of people.
Now we know how to torture Sumit. Take his music and like make a really bad version.
I almost wonder if code comes from a different place though. Like you want to share this, like Tom will sit down and rewrite something because he needs it to achieve this goal.
Right.
And you're like, boy, if this could save a bunch of people time.
Yeah, totally.
Music isn't quite that, right? You're expressing something as opposed to code you're achieving.
Yeah, it's like the distinction between like a technical skill that like you're remixing because you need to learn how to achieve this skill versus personal expression.
Yeah.
Like this is actually an expression of me in my personality or my creative effort. But I'm happy to give you everything you need to know to use my methods, but not necessarily to produce the same personal expression.
Exactly. Like, I'd be happy to teach. Like if I had the best guitar learning technique that I've figured out this system, I'd be happy to give it to somebody else and show them how to do it. But then songs.
Yeah, one of the cases that we saw in Scratch, it's kind of like that. But this girl who made a character called Maki Tak, actually that was her username as well. It was like a little lizard that walks around, and she made it in a way so that. Well, I don't know if it was on purpose or not, but basically the character was simple enough, but also really kind of cute, and that other kids will start to make their own takis. They call them takis, so you could create, Lily-Taki or something like that, and then they will make this really cool, their own versions of this lizard, and she basically created this whole world of Maki tags, and they had their own names. They were like, oh yeah, we're all takis. They kind of became a group this way, and she really embraced that, and she kind of became the spokesperson almost of this group. And at the beginning, I was surprised because I was like, this is probably a character that Disney made or something, because it would seem kind of like Disney-like. And I was like, it's probably something that they copied from somewhere else. But it turns out that she actually made it. And then I was even more surprised because her father contacted us and he said, it's great that my girl is like she's sharing this work and whatever. But now it turns out that some kids are making T-shirts with the character and they're selling them. And they're like, can you stop that? Well, first of all, we cannot because that was happening in like Sassel or one of those other websites. And second is like, I think it's great, but what can you do? and the girl actually really liked it. That she was really excited that people were making T-shirts with that.
Different too, because I think that's maybe more what I feel about the music thing. Because I feel like it's not so much that I wouldn't ever want to have someone else reuse it, but I'd want them to use it in kind. Like I'd want to have this is like a background I would kind of use for this kind of film, and if someone's like, oh, I've got a film like that, and I'd love to use this as a background music, well, that's great, like, I'm really happy to see that. And if someone else is like, well, they used it in a feature film, and they didn't pay me any money, I'm like, oh, that's fine, that's really cool. But like, if someone's like, no, I'm going to use this and like put it in like a horror film or something like that, then I'd be like, no, that's...
Actually, this example reminded me of this, adults doing this. So I don't know if you've seen this. This is an artist, his name is Richard Prince. And he basically, what he does is that he takes pictures of Marlboro ads and he blows them up like really, really big, like he's a photographer. So he just takes pictures of photographs and then exhibits them on, in this case, in the Guggenheim Museum. And he actually gets paid like, $3 million for this photograph. And it's just a photo of a photo.
Took the cigarette off.
He did?
Background.
And it's cropped.
Yeah. No, I think it's just cropped.
Yeah.
It's a photo of a photo.
It's a photo of a photo, and it's a photo of an ad. And what happened is the guy who took the first photo for Marlboro, he was paid by Marlboro. He became really upset and he sued him. And he said, I don't want money, I just want credit because this guy is taking pictures of my work and he's getting like $5 million for the photos.
That's nuts.
Yeah.
That's even more.
He's not changing anything.
So is it like just political commentary on Marlboro?
Something like that, yeah. And actually, recently I saw this guy took pictures of, so there was this book of Rastafari people in Jamaica, and he took pictures of the pictures, and he added some funny like mustaches or whatever to some of the people, and then he exhibited these photos again in like a museum like Guggenheim, and they got sued and they actually lost, and it was one of the first cases where fair use is lost in a way that artists felt that they were not supporting this guy because they thought that this guy was like a leech in some ways, like he was capitalizing on the work of other people. And one of the things that the judge asked him is, what are you contributing? One of the rules of fair use is that you have to make a transformation. Right. And he's like, no, he didn't have an answer for that. And
He took his degree.
Yeah.
All right, you guys.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for coming. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.